A weathered mountain cabin, a wild predator that rejected every chance at safety, and a combat veteran's family carrying invisible wounds that only another survivor could understand. When the Cascade Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary received an urgent call on September 15, 2024, about a critically injured bobcat found near the Oregon-Washington border, no one anticipated this rescue would become one of the most extraordinary human-animal connections ever documented. The animal had been discovered by hikers along the Salmon River Trail, trapped in an illegal snare that had been abandoned for weeks. Local wildlife officers estimated the young male bobcat, roughly 18 months old, had been fighting the wire trap for at least 10 days before rescue teams could reach the remote location. The injuries were severe. Deep lacerations around his neck and front leg where the snare had cut through fur and flesh, infected wounds from his desperate attempts to escape, and extreme dehydration that had pushed him to the brink of death. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the sanctuary's head veterinarian with over 12 years of experience treating wild predators, knew immediately this would be a challenging case. The bobcat's physical condition was critical enough, but what concerned her most was his psychological state. During the initial examination, the animal showed signs of extreme trauma that went beyond typical capture stress. His eyes held a hollow, distant look she had seen before in animals that had endured prolonged suffering. The Cascade Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, nestled in the dense forests of southwestern Washington, had built its reputation on successfully rehabilitating and releasing injured wildlife back into their natural habitats. Founded 15 years earlier by a group of dedicated conservationists, the facility housed state-of-the-art medical equipment and spacious recovery enclosures designed to minimize human contact while providing optimal healing environments. But September 2024 had already proven to be an unusually difficult month for the sanctuary staff. Climate-related disasters across the Pacific Northwest had resulted in a surge of injured wildlife cases. Forest fires, severe storms, and habitat destruction had pushed the facility beyond its normal capacity. Every enclosure was occupied, medical supplies were running low, and the dedicated team of veterinarians, wildlife specialists, and volunteers were working around the clock to provide care for dozens of animals simultaneously. The bobcat, temporarily designated as patient 47 in their medical records, represented just one more challenge in what was becoming an overwhelming season of wildlife emergencies that would test every resource and skill the sanctuary possessed. Dr. Mitchell and her team immediately began intensive treatment protocols for patient 47. The bobcat's infected wounds required daily cleaning and antibiotic injections, while his severe malnutrition demanded carefully monitored feeding schedules to prevent refeeding syndrome. Wildlife rehabilitation specialist Jake Thompson, a 10-year veteran of predator care, took charge of the physical recovery plan. His body is responding to treatment, Thompson reported during the morning staff briefing 3 days after arrival. The wounds are beginning to heal and he's gaining weight steadily, but there's something else going on here that's complicating everything. The sanctuary's standard protocol for bobcat rehabilitation involved gradual conditioning to reduce fear of humans while maintaining enough wariness to survive in the wild. Most bobcats rescued showed predictable patterns: initial aggression followed by cautious acceptance of care, then steady progress toward release readiness. Patient 47 defied every expectation. Unlike typical wild predators that either fought or fled when approached, this bobcat exhibited complete emotional shutdown. He would press himself against the back wall of his medical enclosure, trembling uncontrollably whenever staff members entered. His breathing would become rapid and shallow, and his pupils would dilate to the point where his golden eyes appeared almost black. The medical team had to sedate him for even basic wound care because his panic responses were so severe they interfered with healing. Sanctuary Director Maria Valdez had supervised over 300 bobcat rehabilitations during her career, but she had never encountered such profound psychological trauma in a wild animal. "It's like he's given up completely," she confided to Dr. Mitchell. "Most predators retain some fighting spirit even when severely injured. This one acts like he's already dead inside." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The situation became more complicated when patient 47 began refusing food entirely. For 48 hours, he wouldn't touch the fresh rabbit, fish, or specialized carnivore nutrition supplements placed in his enclosure. His weight, which had been slowly increasing, started dropping again. Forced feeding would require daily sedation, adding dangerous stress to an already fragile animal. Animal behaviorist Dr. Lisa Chen was called in for consultation. After observing patient 47 for several hours through remote monitoring cameras, her assessment was troubling. This level of dissociation suggests prolonged trauma beyond just the physical injuries, she explained. The snare trap may have been the final trauma, but this animal has likely endured multiple traumatic experiences. Wild animals can develop complex PTSD symptoms similar to humans. Time was running out, and traditional rehabilitation methods were proving completely ineffective. After 2 weeks of intensive care, patient 47's medical file painted a discouraging picture. Despite the physical wounds healing properly under Dr. Mitchell's expert treatment, the Bobcat's psychological condition continued deteriorating. His weight had stabilized but remained below healthy levels, and his behavioral assessments showed no improvement whatsoever. Wildlife rehabilitation required animals to demonstrate basic survival instincts before release consideration. Patient 47 failed every standard evaluation. He wouldn't hunt live prey, showed no territorial behaviors, and displayed zero defensive responses when presented with perceived threats. Most concerning was his complete lack of grooming behavior, a critical indicator of psychological health in felines. "We've tried everything in our standard protocol," Jake Thompson admitted during the weekly case review meeting. "Environmental enrichment, varied feeding schedules, gradual desensitization techniques, even playing recorded Bobcat vocalizations to stimulate natural responses. Nothing works." Dr. Chen had attempted multiple behavioral interventions specifically designed for traumatized predators. She introduced scent markers from other successfully rehabilitated bobcats, provided elevated perches and hiding spots that should have appealed to his natural instincts, and even tried reverse psychology by completely ignoring his presence. Each approach yielded the same result. Patient 47 remained catatonic in his corner, barely acknowledging the world around him. The sanctuary's policy required difficult decisions when animals showed no rehabilitation progress after 30 days. With limited space and resources, keeping an animal that might never recover meant potentially turning away other rescues that had better survival chances. Maria Valdez had made these heartbreaking calls before, but each one took a piece of her soul. "His physical health is stable enough that he's not suffering," Dr. Mitchell explained during the crisis meeting, "but he's not living either. He exists in a state somewhere between life and death, and we haven't found any way to bring him back." The sanctuary explored alternative options. Permanent sanctuary placement required animals to show some quality of life indicators. Educational program participation needed animals that could tolerate human interaction without extreme stress. Even transfer to a specialized trauma facility required baseline responsiveness that patient 47 simply didn't demonstrate. 3 different wildlife experts had evaluated the case, and their conclusions were unanimous. The young bobcat appeared beyond psychological repair. His trauma had created mental barriers that professional intervention couldn't penetrate. Unless something extraordinary happened within the next few days, the most humane option might be the one nobody wanted to consider. Patient 47 had become the sanctuary's most heartbreaking case, a beautiful wild creature whose spirit seemed irretrievably broken. Dr. Mitchell made one final attempt using a revolutionary new technique she had read about in wildlife rehabilitation journals.
The method involved complete sensory isolation, followed by gradual reintroduction of natural stimuli. Patient 47's enclosure was modified to eliminate all artificial lighting, sounds, and human scents. Only natural forest sounds played softly through hidden speakers, and his meals were delivered through a remote feeding system that required no human presence.
For 5 days, the sanctuary staff monitored patient 47 through infrared cameras, hoping the elimination of all human-associated stressors might allow his natural instincts to resurface. The results were initially promising. He began moving around his enclosure during nighttime hours and showed interest in different areas of his habitat. But when staff attempted to reintroduce even minimal human contact, his shutdown response returned immediately. A renowned wildlife behaviorist from the University of Washington, Dr. Robert Hayes, flew in specifically to evaluate the case. His expertise with traumatized predators had saved dozens of seemingly hopeless animals. After spending 3 days observing patient 47 and reviewing all previous intervention attempts, his assessment was devastating. "I've worked with combat-stressed military working dogs, circus animals with severe abuse histories, and predators rescued from illegal breeding operations," Dr. Hayes told the assembled sanctuary team. "This Bobcat's psychological profile matches the most severe cases I've encountered. His trauma response has essentially rewired his brain to perceive all external stimuli as threats." The behaviorist recommended a controversial last resort treatment involving pharmaceutical intervention, anti-anxiety medications, combined with intensive behavioral conditioning. However, the treatment would take months to show results, assuming it worked at all, and carried significant risks, including potential liver damage and dependency issues that could permanently compromise the animal's ability to survive in the wild. Maria Valdez faced the sanctuary's most difficult decision in 15 years of operation. The board of directors had scheduled an emergency meeting for Friday afternoon to discuss patient 47's future. With winter approaching and their facility already overcrowded with injured wildlife, continuing to invest resources in what appeared to be a hopeless case meant potentially sacrificing other animals with better recovery prospects. 2 veterinary technicians had already volunteered to take extended shifts to continue trying with patient 47, but everyone knew that dedication alone wouldn't heal psychological wounds this severe. The young bobcat needed something that traditional wildlife rehabilitation couldn't provide, something that nobody at the sanctuary had been able to identify or deliver. By Thursday evening, all conventional options had been exhausted, and the Friday deadline loomed with heartbreaking inevitability. Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez hadn't intended to visit any wildlife facilities that Friday morning. The 34-year-old Army veteran was driving his family through the Pacific Northwest on what was supposed to be a healing vacation, their first extended trip together since his medical discharge 6 months earlier. His wife, Elena, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, had planned the route specifically to avoid crowded tourist destinations that might trigger his anxiety. David's military service had ended abruptly after an IED explosion in Afghanistan left him with a traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Loud noises sent him into panic attacks. Crowds made him hypervigilant to the point of exhaustion, and nightmares robbed him of sleep most nights. Elena watched helplessly as the confident soldier she'd married disappeared behind walls of trauma and medication that dulled his personality along with his pain. Their daughter Sophie had been researching wildlife sanctuaries along their route, part of a school project about animal conservation. When she spotted the sign for Cascade Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, she begged her parents to stop. "Please, Dad, I promise we'll just look around quickly. I need photos for my presentation." Elena noticed David's hands tightening on the steering wheel, his usual response to unexpected changes in plans. "We don't have to go inside, honey," she said gently. "Maybe they have a visitor center or gift shop." But something about Sophie's excitement reminded David of better times, before deployments and explosions changed everything. Against his usual instincts to avoid unfamiliar places, he turned into the sanctuary's gravel parking lot. The facility appeared quiet and peaceful, surrounded by towering evergreen trees that created a natural sound barrier from the outside world. Jake Thompson happened to be near the visitor center when the family approached. He immediately noticed David's military bearing and the subtle signs of hypervigilance, the way his eyes constantly scanned surroundings, his positioning near the exit, the slight tremor in his hands. As a volunteer firefighter, Jake had worked with several veterans and recognized the familiar patterns.
"Welcome to Cascade Ridge," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "I'm Jake Thompson, one of the wildlife specialists here. Is there something specific you'd like to learn about?" Sophie launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her school project, while Elena apologized for the impromptu visit. David remained silent, but Jake noticed how his posture relaxed slightly in the peaceful environment. The veteran's eyes seemed drawn to the forest beyond the buildings, as if seeking exit routes or simply appreciating the natural tranquility. "We actually have an interesting case right now that might be relevant to your daughter's project," Jake mentioned, studying David's demeanor carefully. "A young bobcat we're rehabilitating. He's been through some trauma, and we're working on helping him recover." Something in Jake's tone caught David's attention. The word trauma resonated in a way that made him look directly at the wildlife specialist for the first time. Elena noticed the subtle shift in her husband's posture, less defensive, more curious. "Can we see him?" Sophie asked excitedly, but Jake hesitated. "Well, he's in our intensive care area, and he's having some challenges adjusting to people. We usually don't allow visitors in that section." He paused, observing David's reaction. "But if you're genuinely interested in understanding wildlife rehabilitation, maybe Dr. Mitchell could give you a brief overview." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Mitchell emerged from the medical building, looking exhausted. She'd spent the morning preparing for the afternoon's difficult decision about patient 47. When Jake introduced the family, she managed a weary smile. "Your timing is interesting," she said to Sophie. "We're dealing with a very challenging case, a bobcat that's struggled to respond to our usual rehabilitation methods." David found himself speaking before he realized it. "What kind of trauma?" His voice was quiet but direct, catching Elena by surprise. He rarely initiated conversations with strangers. Dr. Mitchell exchanged a glance with Jake. "He was trapped in a snare for an extended period. When we rescued him, his physical injuries were severe, but the psychological damage has been more challenging. He's completely withdrawn, won't respond to any of our standard approaches." "Sometimes traditional methods don't work," David said, his words carrying unexpected weight. Elena watched her husband with growing amazement. She hadn't seen him engage with a topic this directly in months. "You have experience with trauma recovery?" Dr. Mitchell asked, sensing something in David's tone. "Military. Afghanistan." David's response was brief but loaded with understanding. "Sometimes the visible wounds heal, but the invisible ones." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Jake recognized an opportunity. "Would you be interested in seeing him? Not as visitors, but as someone who might understand what he's going through. Sometimes trauma survivors recognize something in each other that medical professionals miss." Elena held her breath, knowing this could either help David or trigger a setback. But something in her husband's expression told her this was different. This felt like the first spark of genuine interest he'd shown in anything since coming home. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Mitchell led the family through the sanctuary's quiet corridors towards the intensive care wing. David walked slightly behind Elena and Sophie, his trained eyes automatically noting exit routes and potential threats. old habits that civilian life hadn't erased. But something about the sanctuary's atmosphere felt different from other public spaces. The sounds were natural,
Organic, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the soft murmur of running water from outdoor enclosures. "We call him Patient 47, Dr. Mitchell explained, as they approached the isolation area. "We've tried everything in our rehabilitation protocols, but he remains completely unresponsive. Today is actually—" She hesitated, glancing at Sophie. "Today, we're making some difficult decisions about his future." They stopped outside a large, naturalistic enclosure designed to mimic forest habitat. David positioned himself where he could see both the animal and maintain awareness of his surroundings, a compromise between his anxiety and genuine curiosity. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, huddled a motionless form. "He stays in that exact spot," Jake said quietly. "Hasn't moved more than a few feet from that corner in 2 weeks." David studied the Bobcat's posture, the way Patient 47 pressed against the wall, making himself as small as possible, eyes unfocused and distant. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. He'd seen that exact position before, in mirrors during his worst days. The hollow stare, the defensive positioning, the complete disconnection from surroundings. "He's not just hiding," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's guarding." Elena noticed her husband's hands had stopped trembling, something that rarely happened in unfamiliar situations. Sophie pressed close to the glass, fascinated by her first sight of a wild bobcat, even one in such poor condition. "Guarding against what?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "Everything. Everyone. The whole world." David moved closer to the enclosure, his movement deliberate and slow. "When everything around you becomes a threat, you find the safest corner you can and you defend it, even if defending means just existing." Patient 47's ears twitched slightly, the first response to human presence anyone had documented in days. David noticed immediately. "You see that?" he asked Dr. Mitchell. "He heard something different in my voice. Trauma survivors recognize each other sometimes, even across species." Elena felt tears forming as she watched her husband display more animation and insight than she'd seen in months. Sophie pressed close to the glass, fascinated by her first sight of a wild bobcat, even one in such poor condition. David asked Dr. Mitchell if he could sit near the enclosure. Against standard protocol for visitor interactions, she found herself nodding. Something about the veteran's calm confidence and obvious understanding of trauma made her trust his instincts. Jake brought a simple folding chair and positioned it about 6 feet from the glass. "I'm going to try something," David said, settling into the chair without any sudden movements. "Sometimes the best way to connect with someone who's shut down is to show them you understand what it's like to be broken." Elena and Sophie watched in amazement as David began speaking to Patient 47 in low, steady tones. He didn't use baby talk or the artificially cheerful voice most people adopted around animals. Instead, he spoke as one survivor to another. "I know what it's like when everything feels dangerous, when your own mind turns against you, and every sound, every movement, every person feels like a threat. I know what it's like to find a corner and just disappear into it." Patient 47's ears rotated toward David's voice, subtle movement, but movement nonetheless. Dr. Mitchell felt her pulse quicken. This was more response than they'd seen in weeks. David continued talking, describing his own experiences with hypervigilance, how crowded places made his skin crawl, how he'd learned to position himself near exits in restaurants, how simple sounds could trigger overwhelming panic responses. He spoke without self-pity or drama, just honest recognition of shared experience. "The thing about corners," David said, "is they keep you safe, but they also keep you trapped. I spent 6 months in corners, literal and metaphorical ones.
Still do, some days.
For the first time since his rescue, patient 47 lifted his head and looked directly at David. The contact lasted only seconds, but everyone present felt the significance of that moment. The Bobcat's golden eyes held a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Not quite hope, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of his isolation. Sophie whispered to her mother, "Mom, is Daddy helping the kitty feel better?" Elena couldn't answer immediately. She was witnessing something extraordinary, her husband connecting with another traumatized being in a way that seemed to heal both of them simultaneously. David's own anxiety symptoms had virtually disappeared while he focused on understanding and helping patient 47. "Maybe they're helping each other, sweetheart," she finally whispered back, watching her husband demonstrate more emotional stability than he'd shown since his discharge. The connection was undeniable, and Dr. Mitchell knew they were witnessing something that could change everything. Over the following weeks, David made daily trips to the sanctuary, each visit bringing remarkable progress for both veteran and Bobcat. Patient 47 began eating regularly, moving around his enclosure, and showing natural curiosity about his environment. David's own healing accelerated dramatically, his nightmares decreased, his anxiety became manageable, and Elena watched her husband return to himself. The breakthrough came when Dr. Mitchell suggested something unprecedented: home placement with the Rodriguez family. "Traditional release protocols aren't working," she explained, "but patient 47 has bonded with David in a way we've never seen. Some animals aren't meant to return to the wild, they're meant to become bridges between worlds." Elena worried about the challenges, but Sophie's enthusiasm and David's obvious transformation convinced her. The sanctuary worked with state wildlife authorities to secure special permits for educational sanctuary placement. Patient 47, now renamed Phoenix by Sophie, would live with the family while participating in wildlife education programs. 6 months later, Phoenix roams freely around the Rodriguez property's secure perimeter, healthy and content. David credits the Bobcat with saving his life, while Phoenix demonstrates none of his previous trauma symptoms. They've become local celebrities, visiting schools to teach children about wildlife conservation and the healing power of understanding. Sometimes the most broken souls are the ones who understand each other best, David tells audiences during their presentations. "Phoenix taught me that healing doesn't always mean going back to who you were before. Sometimes it means becoming someone entirely new." Elena films their daily interactions, sharing their story online to help other veterans and wildlife rehabilitation efforts. Their YouTube channel has become a beacon of hope for trauma survivors worldwide. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to see that healing is possible. Sometimes the most unexpected connections create the most beautiful transformations. Help us continue bringing these incredible true stories to light, because every broken soul deserves a chance to soar again.